Hello, good afternoon. This is very new to me to see you looking at me with headphones on. So I want lots of thumbs up, smiles. You can do thumbs down even, but just to enable to get the engagement. And I'm so excited to be here in Copenhagen. I am from Dallas, Texas, from the US. Yeah, you can do thumbs down to that one if you think. But I am an OBGYN gynecologist, but I focus on midlife in women, perimenopause, menopause, longevity, and what we can do as practitioners, but also for women, what they can do in order to enhance their life. So we're going to give you some tips. We're going to give you just real feedback on what's going on biologically, but how we can push back against what we see biologically, because that's what's happening in the lifespan of a woman, is to understand what's going on and how do we create better health span and wealth span and brain span for ourselves. Let's see if this works. Oh, so here we go, menopause and longevity. But menopause in general is a term that usually is associated with something that we don't want to become or something we don't want to enter, because that's what society has created around the word menopause, something that comes with aches and pains and no happiness, or how we look or how we appear physically. So really the package of menopause is not something that seems that it should be on the shelf, or we want to keep it on the shelf. So I'm going to give you ways that you want to embrace perimenopause and menopause and how you can extend your health span with things that you can do. So we are tackling aging because aging is one of the main risk factors, if not the risk factor, for chronic disease, for things like cardiovascular disease, dementia, diabetes, obesity, all of those, even cancer. Usually in that top 3 risk factors for that is going to be aging. So aging is something that we can't fight, but we do have the ability to maybe not have a slide. So as we're talking about aging, I'll let them fix the slides. For women specifically, here we go, we know that women typically live longer than men. So if we think of the life expectancy of women, it's somewhere to 78, 80. But those years that we spend living longer than men are usually in poorer health. So that's not something that evens out. Or that's something that we would want to do, is live longer but in poorer health. But when we think of menopause and that transition, which usually the average age is about 52, we spend 40% of our lives in the postmenopausal phase. So why would we want to give up 40% of our lives living not better? And a lot of that has to do with biologically what's going on. And so those hormonal changes that occur in the perimenopausal and menopausal change, usually due to progesterone, estrogen, and testosterone, those are the changes that actually accelerate the aging process in women. If the life expectancy of women was around 57, 58 in the early 1900s, it correlated with the lifespan of the ovary, which gives off most of our estrogen and testosterone and progesterone. But now that we have surpassed that in life expectancy of living longer, what's one thing that we haven't caught up with? The life of the ovary. The ovary still is pretty much the only organ that ages and somewhat dies, if you want to put it that way, at an early age, but we extend our life beyond that. So there's a disconnect. There's a disconnect between the life of the ovary and the life expectancy of a woman. So once you start to make that connection, you'll see how imperative hormones become in the longevity of women. I'm not doing very well with this clicker. So aging is inevitable, but how do we approach it? Like I said before, aging is the #1 risk factor for chronic disease. So it really is a public health pandemic because everyone is going to age. We can't fight that. But we do have this gap that we have to meet. So this here was just recently, when we think of longevity and lifespan, for women specifically, Women's Health magazine in the US, we have now focused on it from a women's perspective. And so I was glad to be along some of my colleagues here in some of the kind of pioneers in women's longevity, because it needs to be looked at differently than when we think of males versus females, specifically because of estrogen. So we said that on average, women spend the last 12 to 14 years of their lives declining in health, which is accelerated by, again, that decline in estrogen. So what are those steps that we can take when we think of health span, brain span, lifespan? A lot of it can be things that we can do when it comes to possibly hormone therapy, lifestyle with exercise and nutrition. That's where we can focus our research and where we have when we think of what's going on with a woman during that transition. Now, we know that the symptoms of perimenopause and menopause, hot flashes, night sweats, all of those feel horrible, but not only do they feel horrible, there's a lot that's going on biologically with all the organs because of estrogen receptors are all over the body. So you can look at this list right here, which is a very small list of the symptoms that women go through and start to go through even as early 40s, late 30s. So if you think of the lifespan of that transition, it can be from as early as 40, and some women still have these symptoms up until 60. So that's a good 20-year time frame for some women. Not all in that severity, in that intensity, but something's going on. Now, it makes sense that you would have these symptoms because estrogen receptors are all over the body. So if you have this messenger, this chemical messenger of estrogen that is not able to deliver a message to all of the parts of the body, that's why we start to see such significant decline in all of the body organs and systems when we think of chronic disease symptoms and lifelong complications such as dementia, cardiovascular disease, osteoporosis impacting the bone, and also our muscles. Our muscle mass also declines. So hormone therapy is one of those ways that we can combat what happens in that transition for women in order to change the aging process, add longevity and WellSpan, and also relieve the symptoms that women feel as they go through perimenopause and menopause. So what are the current indications that we have? A lot of it has to do with symptoms, right? So for women who do partake in hormone therapy, usually they're coming with a symptom. Hot flashes, night sweats, sleep disturbances, mood changes, irritability. But what do we know about hormone therapy and longevity? A lot of that has not been expanded, but we are starting to see the impact of keeping women on hormone therapy for a longer time frame to offset the body systems and the biologic changes that are coming with aging and that have been precipitated by the decline in estrogen and also testosterone as well. Also, what are the benefits of hormone therapy? Obviously, we usually relate it just to symptoms, but what do we know from research? That the exposure to testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone help with heart health, bone mineral density, help with brain, decreasing inflammation, decreasing antioxidant processes, and also helping the bone and muscle. So if we know all of these things are helping, how are we not sending this message to women to understand the longevity aspect when we think of hormones? So is there a magic recipe for longevity? Not so much, but we do know that there is so much that's included in this kind of cauldron of things that are really going to help with how we approach aging, how we conceptualize it, and what is everyone's magic recipe for themselves. Because it's never going to be just one recipe. It's going to be a recipe of how many people are sitting right here individually. And that's going to differ based on age, past medical history, family history, also lifestyle, and how you approach before you get to the aging process, during the aging process, and even into your latter years of your 80s, 90s, or even 100s if you get there. One important aspect when we think of the hormone influence on the body is the brain. So when we look at dementia, usually Alzheimer's, 70% of those cases are women. But we've known this for decades. But we never really figured out why this was occurring in 2/3 of women and seeing it significantly when something was realized very recently of how estrogen decline impacts the brain. There is such a significant impact on what happens with the brain, whether it's with memory, cognition, the ability to focus, and a lot of that had to do with estrogen, because estrogen decreases inflammation, it enhances neuroplasticity, it also modulates and talks to our neurotransmitters, namely serotonin and dopamine. And so when all of these factors with just one organ are impacted, it would only make sense that if we increase the exposure to estrogen over time, that we're going to see a decline in the impact of what happens with our brain. And so again, when we think of that aging process, what influences do we have with the tools that are available to us? And that again comes in the form of hormone therapy and being open to not only what does it do for your symptoms, but long-term risk of when we think of Alzheimer's disease and cognitive decline. So the research is there, but the message hasn't necessarily been sent to everybody. So estradiol is a master regulator. I call it the golden hormone because it impacts so much of our bodies. It gives us vitality. And when we're talking about the brain, you can see in that slide there, on that picture on the right, on the column, the first column is what the brain looks like in a woman from pre-menopause. So this is roughly in your 30s, 20s and 30s of what the brain looks like. And if you can see that change in the right, on the column there, that's the postmenopausal change. And those are the changes that occur over time when there's a lack of exposure to estrogen. And this is where we're seeing those significant changes in compounding. Aging always will have an impact on how our bodies are able to regulate homeostasis. But when you compound it with a decline in estrogen, you're going to see that increase significantly. So estrogen really is the lifeline for most of our organs. When we think of cardioprotection, when we think of bone strength, when we think of muscle, when we think of just the actual power that we're able to have in our muscle and our bone and that complex of that system. And it also acts as an antioxidant. And so what we know in research in rats, we're trying to collaborate those changes that we see in rats into humans, is that it has the ability to induce antioxidants in longevity-related genes. And this is where research is going when we think of longevity in conjunction with hormones. But also, how does it actually play a role when we think of age, when we think of a centenarian longevity? And so if you look at this slide here on the bottom, everything that's in pink, girl, boy, it's not saying that girls are better. I mean, maybe it is. However, not to be distracted, but anything that's in pink is going to what we see a positive influence, right? And so when we look at the top of centenarian longevity, sex hormones and bone turnover have positive correlation, but that positive correlation obviously has to do with that triad of sex hormones with estrogen. Now, what are the two things that we see in blue that are decreasing or have a negative correlation with aging as a centurion is our nutritional status and abdominal obesity, right? Because that's going to increase inflammation. It's going to increase your risk of having long-term disease like cardiovascular disease and diabetes. But those are the things, magically, that we have the ability to offset, right? So that's a good thing. So even those two are negative, we have the ability and lifestyle to offset that. And that's what I'm going to talk about right now, that silver bullet that everyone in this auditorium right now has the ability to impact is exercise. Exercise is medicine. Exercise is the consistent link that's going to offset so much of the organ system in helping longevity. That's that thing that can combat the aging process. And we all have the ability to do that. So exercise obviously comes in different forms. I know what we see on social media, it's always going to be one thing is going to help, but it's never one thing. Always remember that. It's never one thing that's going to do the job. Exercises, obviously weight training, if I were to pick one of them, resistance training is going to be the best because it's going to build your bone and your muscle. But we also have to think of, in an aging metric, we also have to think of flexibility, our posture, balance, because all of this relates to functionality as we age. And so the ability for you to be on the floor and get up without having to roll over and get yourself up, or having to hold somebody or something to get up, is the functionality, and that also requires your balance, your posture, and your flexibility. In addition to resistance training. All of those are forms of exercise. Is all my time taken up by fixing these slides? Strength training. I like to focus on strength training because for so long women have been told by society that weight training is for men, cardiovascular exercise is for women. What do we know from research? As we start to age, we lose 3 to 5% of our muscle mass every decade. That's accelerated after menopause. Why? Estrogen. We've talked about that. So they did a study and they were looking at now dementia. So now we know that it impacts muscle mass, it improves our bone, but how does it impact our brain? It impacts our brain because as we start to increase our exercise, it's impacting our ability to decrease the risk of dementia. They did a study and they actually followed women for over 44 years and looking at the outcome of dementia in correlation with exercise. And so if we look at that bottom sentence, they had a test for women that they initially had to complete. And for those that completed the test, they followed these women out 44 years. Those ones that were able to complete the test were 88% less likely to develop dementia. So when you put those correlations between exercise and dementia, right, that's one part of the scheme of what we're going through. So we already talked about hormones and the lack of estrogen, but now we have a controllable factor, which is exercise. We get to partake in that, and that also is going to help with decreasing your risk of dementia. So the lifestyle approach is important because we have bodily changes as we start to enter this phase in life, but that doesn't mean it has to look like that. Most of the patients that I see in my office walk in and they're like, what happened here? I woke up and something was here. And that's typically how it feels. Everything that you're doing is not working anymore. Or even if you're like, I'm going to decrease how many calories I take or how many carbs I take in, still, they're like, this problem's still here. But it's not necessarily just one problem. This is related to our insulin and our glucose. It's related to our fat cells and how they migrate from hips and buttocks up to the abdomen. It also is, how do our fat cells have the ability to shrink when we want them to, or not shrink when we want them to? And all of those have a role in aging, hormone decline, and also change in how we exercise by utilizing more weight training to increase our muscle mass, which is already going down. So we've got to fight that. And all of these together is the magic recipe. So what does this all mean? What does it mean altogether? It means that we're getting better with this topic of longevity. We're understanding that as women live longer, we want them to live better. We're understanding that the decline and the ovarian follicular wasting that occurs in mid-age, around 50, is that has a really profound impact on a woman's life. And so when we think of it collectively, from head to toe, our entire bodies are being impacted by this transition. And so the more that we pay attention to it, the more that we advocate for research, the more that women collectively join together and understand that we're in this together, that's where we're going to see that we're underrepresented and under-researched, and we need to change that, that it's a multi-pronged approach. It is never, no diet fad is ever gonna work. No one exercise is gonna work. It requires everyone to figure out for themselves in a personalized, individualized way of all these things together, how am I going to make all of them work for me? And so with that, I wrote a book last year, Generation M, on perimenopause and menopause. And what it was looking at, again, was the entire picture of this wonderful transition in all of our lives that women will go through, and how to approach that in a way where we feel embodied, where we know it's from head to toe experience, and where we understand that we also have the ability to be a part of this beautiful aging process. And so I hope today, as you go around and seeing that we are able to be the best versions of ourselves with every tool that we have available to us, I hope that you can be empowered and encouraged to embrace the aging process. Thank you so much.